Hi there! In this series, I'll be showcasing how to build a custom app on make.com from scratch. I'll show you all the steps that you need to complete in order to build, deploy, and then if you want, publish the app on the Make marketplace. For the purposes of this video series, I'll be using Gavel, which is a document automation platform popular within law firms. In this first episode, we'll cover a few topics, such as what are Make custom apps and why do you need them? What is Gavel, so that you have a basic understanding of the platform and its functionalities. Setting up the basics of the app, such as the name, the logo, and the base URLs. Authentication, which obviously will be necessary if you want to make any requests to the app. And finally, making our first few requests using the universal module in Make. And then also, if time allows, building a few of the first modules. Now, this series won't have any fancy edits. It will just be a raw video of myself building out this integration and commenting things as I go along so that you can see the full process and what it takes to deploy a custom app on Make. Let's kick things off with understanding what are custom apps in Make and why would you need them. When you open up a new scenario and try to add a new module in Make, you obviously have a long list of different apps. And for these, the Make team or the developers of the app have already developed the connectors so that you can easily add them to your scenario and use them. Now, what happens if you have an app that you are utilizing that doesn't have a connector available? Obviously, one of the options is to try to check on other automation platforms if it has a connector such as Zapier, or using the HTTP module inside of Make. This module allows you to make any custom API call, and actually can also store the connection to the service using an API key authentication or auth. The issue with this is that every time that you would want to make a request or define a new module in any one of your scenarios, you'll need to set up the structure of the request yourself, right, from scratch. Obviously, you can copy and paste from different scenarios, but that's not obviously the most easy to use or user-friendly option, especially if you're building a lot with that app, and especially as well if you then give these automations to support to other people, because obviously then as well they require much more knowledge in terms of how to structure these requests. So that's really where the custom apps come in. The custom apps allow you to build an app inside of Make, which can be either private to your organization or public. I'll talk about the different levels that are available in just a moment, that will look exactly the same as you can see here, such for example, Google Calendar, Zoho CRM, Facebook, etc. You'll be able to click on that app, it will have its logo, it will have its name, and it will have a set of modules defined here, which you can use, including triggers, such as webhook triggers, any search actions, create actions, etc. Now, there are multiple levels of visibility to custom apps. So once you build it out, by default, it will be just private to your organization and Make. If you want to then share that app with other users, you can convert it into a public app, and it will give you a share link, which you can then share with anybody that wants to use it, and they'll be able to install that app onto their organization. Now, a level above that would be actually converting that public app into a community marketplace app, which will also be discoverable by other people inside of the Make community. If you head over to the integrations page on make.com, you'll be able to see that there are obviously all the verified apps, right? Your Gmails, Airtables, Discords, etc. But then there is also this other category called community apps, in which there are about 120 apps at the moment, which are supported and developed by the community. So these are public apps which have passed a basic business review by the Make team, and which anybody that wants to can discover on the make.com website. Click on them, learn more about what the app does, about as well the developer of the app, and be able to install it. Now, Make then gives the option to the developers of the apps to also monetize these apps, so they can either, again, provide them free of charge, or also charge either subscription or a one-time fee for anybody that wants to use that app in their organization. And then really the last level of app visibility would be verified apps, which pass a much more thorough technical review by the Make team and will be available to anybody using Make without any necessary extra installation steps, just as with HubSpot, Calendly, or any other popular apps, and also have this verified badge over here. Now that is usually reserved just to the actual developer of the app itself, the software provider, which then works in tandem with the Make team and verifies this app and deploys it for everybody to use. For again the purposes of this demo, we'll be building a public community app, which again will be available for everybody, but then supported by an agency such as ourselves. Now that we have an understanding of what custom apps in Make are, let's head over to Gavel and understand what does the platform do. So again, you have a bit more context in terms of what we are actually building in this tutorial. So again, Gavel is a document automation platform that allows you to create workflows, which are essentially advanced forms. Let me click into the simple form example over here. You're able to define as many pages really as you want, and on each one of those pages you will have a number of questions. All these questions will have a title, the variable name, and then a question type, right? So that would be essentially data type, text area, drop down, multi-select, yes, no, file upload, email, date, etc. You're then obviously able to do some basic stuff such as defining if that question should be required or not. You can then also add conditional logic. So for example, show this if the client name is X, and also add some extra settings such as help text, default values, etc., etc., etc. The cool thing about the platform is that you can also add some more advanced fields, such as, for example, repeating items. So we have this extra page over here for assets. It has a question data type of a repeating item, and within that item we have multiple questions for each one of the, in this case, assets. So for example, like what is the asset type, which again has its own data type, so like a drop down, what is the asset value, descriptive name, etc. And so when the user fills out this form, they'll be able to define as many items as they want. Now, once we have defined the form itself, we then able to add a document template onto it, which can be created using the Microsoft Word add-in provided by Gavel. So this looks like this. When you open up a new Word, again, there are obviously a few examples once you sign up. You'll be able to install the Gavel document tagger. You'll be able to log into your Gavel account using an API key, and then you'll be able to select any of the forms that you have defined. After that, you'll be able to, in any point in the document, insert one of the variables, which then, after the form is submitted, would obviously be populated with whatever data has been submitted on the form. Now, the customization of these fields goes quite a far way with Gavel, because you can do things such as, for example, conditional logic, such as what you can see here, in terms of like, hey, like if address line 2 is not blank, then add it, otherwise don't. You can do things such as, for example, converting any of the text to uppercase or capitalized. For any of the repeating items, you can also do things such as calculating the sums of the values, the total counts, repeating in a loop essentially a piece of text with the values of each one of those repeating items, as you can see here, formatting dates, etc., etc., etc. So it is really quite flexible in that regard. After you have finished creating this template, you can then go onto the website and upload it over here. After the form is completed, it will automatically generate these whatever documents you have defined over here. Can be multiple of them, and then generate the docx, the PDF, or docx and PDF, and also have the ability to actually generate multiple files for each one of the repeating items in case you have defined those in the forms. In this case, we don't need it, but again, a useful feature. Then you can also define the sharing options. For example, if you want to display the finalized documents to the person that has actually filled out the form, if you want the form sent to a particular email address, either hard-coded or an email field from the form, you can also send those documents directly for e-signature using DocuSign, and having some conditional logic in terms of what documents need to be generated when, depending on certain fields in the form. And lastly, you can define as well integrations. So for example, connecting it to a webhook. So once the form has been completed, it will send some information to that webhook. We'll be defining that as part of the build process in later episodes. Obviously defining any access permissions, customizing different messages, and for example, edit some custom styles that you want. Now, again, this is a very quick overview. Obviously, the software can do a few more things, but for the purposes of this demo, I think that will be enough for now. Let's actually see how one of these forms looks like and how one of those generated documents then looks like as well. I'll just replace this engagement letters. I have previously updated it. And let's click Save and click Run. Full name, Lorem 1, Lorem 2, for the city, what practice area you're interested in, and let's drop down, let's say family law, click Continue. And here's how this repeating items field looks like. So what is the asset type? Let's say bank accounts. What is the asset value? Let's say 1,000. Descriptive name, bank account 1. Not particularly descriptive, but good for the purpose of demo. And then we can add as many more as we want. So for example, let's add another one, which would be, let's say 2,500. Give that a descriptive name, let's say crypto wallet 1. And then we can go on and on and on. Click Continue. It will allow us to then review all of the answers. Click Continue again, review all of the answers as well to the full form. And click Continue. It will then generate those documents and display to them, display them to the user. As you can see here, PDF and docx. We also have the option to send it as email. And so if we download it, as you can see, it has put the today's date, put all of the address and name details correctly. For example, capitalized my name over here, included the practice area, calculated the total number of assets, their total value. I think there was a mistake in the formatting. As you can see as well, displayed all of the assets in the format that we have specified with all of their details, and included as well dates, signature fields, etc. So that's a basic demonstration of what Gavel is. Obviously, again, can go much more complex, but for the purpose of this demo will be enough. Let's now head over to Make and start building our custom app. In make.com, you can access your custom apps. Going to the left sidebar, click in Custom Apps, and then create a new app. You'll need to give it a name, say Gavel, a label, user visible, Gavel as well. As for the theme and for the logo, if you head over to the documentation of the custom apps on the Make website, you'll be able to see, and I'll read here on the requirements, there are certain requirements that need to be met in terms of the logo image. So for example, it needs to be PNG, certain dimensions, and essentially what it will do, it will take the logo, it needs to have a transparency layer. What it will do is convert it into a white symbol, as you can see, and put it on top of a color of your choice, this theme. So I have already prepared the file and the color code, so I'll just paste them here. As for the language, we'll leave as English, and audience, you can restrict as well the audience to specific countries, but again, we'll leave as global over here, and then upload the PNG file. And we're now redirected to the configuration of our custom app. As you will see over here, it's marked as private because again, we haven't yet published it. We have the version number, and then we have multiple sections that we'll be filling out as we're building out this app. The base really defines the base structure of all the modules and remote procedures as well. defines the base URL that we're going to be using, how the errors should be handled, and any configuration, let's say, that will be shared across all the different modules that we are building out. In connections, we'll be defining the authentication, so be that API key, auth, or any other type of authentication that's available in the app. Webhooks will be for webhooks, modules will be for the actual modules like search module, action modules, etc. Remote procedures will be kind of like functions that allow us, for example, to when we are creating a record which is linked to another record inside of our app, it will be able, for example, to load the IDs and the names of the record that needs to be linked, in order to make sure that we have as smooth of a user experience, and for example, then the user doesn't have to manually type in the ID of the record that needs to be linked to. Groups will be able to define how our modules are visible inside of the list when that app is selected. So in what essentially order and in what groups they are distributed by. README is, well, a README an explanation of the app. And finally, the app flow explains the different steps that I already alluded to previously in terms of the approval process of your app, how it goes from private to public to community, and then to potentially approved if you want to go down that route, to be made available to all of the Make users. Now, before I continue with setting up the base and the connections, let's go back and check that perfect, our logo displays all fine. We have the theme color, the name is correct, so we can now go proceed with the next step, which will be building out the base and starting with the authentication process. Obviously, for this, we'll now need to look up the API documentation of whatever service we are trying to integrate. In this case, Gavel documentation does not have the best formatting, but does the job. Essentially, in terms of authentication, we'll be using the API key, which is really one of the most simple forms of authentication, so it's perfect. And then it defines a few methods. It's not a huge API, it just has really 5 endpoints that we're going to be using. Creating a workflow session with the data, essentially pre-filling that form, if you can say so, that I've shown in the Gavel demo. Then retrieving the documents from an existing session, downloading documents, and then 2 more simple workflows for listing the workflow names and listing as well the workflow variables that are available, right? Essentially all of the questions that are available inside of a form. We'll kickstart our development with these 2 as their most simple ones, and then we're going to progress onto the more complex ones for the documents and generating the form or the workflow session itself. Now, authentication. How does it work in Gavel? If you scroll down here, in terms of as well how each one of the requests works, you'll be able to see the relative path that you will need to be making your calls to, but it's not very clear to what domain, right, this request need to be sent. And if you scroll down, there is actually an example which says the host should be the domain that you have with Gavel, right? So how Gavel works is, if you go into here, Chromium is the name of our organization over here. So we'll need to be using chromium.gavel.io, and then whatever endpoint is displayed over here. Fantastic. So we now know that the base URL will be essentially this, again, the name of our domain. So we can head over to the base configuration inside of Make. Default request configuration, default base URL for all modules and RPCs. As you can see here, we have a hard-coded value, right? This is used, for example, for services that don't have custom domains. But in this case, we do. So how do we go about it? Make custom app documentation is really nice. And there's actually a specific scenario that is explained over here. So if you head over to base and then base URL, it actually talks about a situation where you would need a variable base URL. And what the article then suggests is that you can set up that custom variable, custom, let's say, domain, for example, inside of the connection configuration, which we'll use for setting up the authentication. And then we'll be able to use whatever parameter net we have defined, for example, connection.sandbox or connection.environment inside of our base URL, right? Cool. All right, so let's head over and back to make. And what we know is that obviously Gavel.io will stay as it is, right? So this part will always be fixed. And so really the only thing that is going to change is this subdomain that the user is assigned. So in this case, we can add a variable. Variables in general in this make configuration are defined with double curly brackets, and it needs to be inside of a string. So as you can see here, inside of a string, double curly brackets. And again, this will be stored under the connection, and whatever we define the parameter, I think in this case it makes sense to just define a domain. So connection.domain, when we are going to set it up for our organization, this will be Corbium, and then .gavel.io, right? So we have our default base URL. In terms of headers for authorization, let's have a look at how that works. Again, going back to the API documentation, authentication for all endpoints is done via X API key header. So let's copy this, X API key, and then your document API key directly, so we don't even need this bearer part, just connection.api key. Fantastic. In terms of response handling, we can also understand then how to display the errors to the user. We'll need to understand how, if there's some kind of error, how the API handles that, and then based on that, we'll be able to define how it is displayed to the user in terms of the status code and the error message. At the moment, I haven't seen that actually defined anywhere in the documentation, so we'll just do it by trial and error. We'll error out one of the endpoints and then see what the API returns so that we can adjust to it. And then finally, in terms of sanitization of the logs, this is essentially useful so that when these requests are made, that any sensitive information such as, for example, the API key is not stored inside of the debug console in the browser. So we can sanitize the request. In this case, what we're going to be sanitizing is this x.api key header x API key, to make sure again our API key is not exposed. That's really it for the base configuration. This should give us something to work with. The only other thing now that we need to do is define a connection, and after that we can actually start defining already our first modules. So let's head over to the connections. Yep, that's all saved. Create a new connection. We'll call it API key, and the type will be an API key. By the way, you can actually also define multiple connections on the same app, for example, if the service allows for that, and then the user, when they are going to be adding their app to a scenario for the first time, they'll be able to choose what type of connection they want to use. For example, some services may offer both API key and OAuth connections. In that case, you can define them here as well. All right, perfect. So first of all, we will need the absolute URL to the API endpoint which validates these credentials. So some APIs have, for example, who is or like who am I endpoint, which once you make a request to it, it will display information about the current user and essentially validate that the connection works. In this case, Gavel apparently doesn't have that, so we can use one of the endpoints here. For example, get in the list of the workflow names for that purpose. And again, I open up the base again so that we can just copy as well the configuration that we're going to have here, because the one thing is in the connection, it doesn't inherit from base, so we'll need to define the full path directly. All right, so the URL will be connection domain Gavel.io, and then this API playground folder equals questions. In terms of headers as well, will be the same. So XAPI key, and then connection API key. Well, sorry. Actually, it's not defined as connection here because we're actually working on connection. It's defined as the parameters to this connection. So this should be parameters.domain and then parameters.api key. Perfect. Let's just move this around a bit. Perfect. And in terms of response handling, again, some services provide some kind of metadata about, for example, the email of the user. In that case as well, when the connection is saved, if a user then goes to the connections tab here inside of Make, they'll be able to see the email that is associated with that particular connection. Again, in this case, we don't have that endpoint, so we don't really have any metadata here. And again, in terms of error handling, we don't yet know how the API responds, so we'll leave it as is for now. Same in terms of log sanitization, we'll do the same thing as we did with the base, omitting the HTTP header. Let's click Save Changes. The only other thing left now for the connection is this parameters over here. We have the API key, but also then we would need this domain, right, value, which will be really of a similar data type. Let's call it domain. The type will be text. The label will be domain portion before. Let's call it domain, and then we'll actually add a help text just below. It will be required as well. And then we'll add a help text just below your Gavel domain, g for example.gavel.io, enter example. Click Save Changes. And before we're able to test out our app in a scenario, we'll need to define our first module. For these purposes, we're going to define a universal module. It's one of those modules that you may have seen if you've worked with Make for any reasonable time, is make an authorized API call. Essentially, what it allows the user to do is to define whatever request body that they want, any other headers as well that they want, but the authentication and the connection will be managed by our custom app. And that module comes in very handy, especially, for example, if the API has been updated, but then the developer of the custom app has not yet updated their connector to include those endpoints. You can still use them with this make an authorized request module or universal module. So let's head over to the modules tab and let's start building it out. Modules. Let's create a new module. This is going to be of type universal. The subtype will be REST because it's a REST interface. API key will be the connection that we've just created. And then in terms of name, label, and description, there's actually a naming convention. If you go to the documentation of the Make custom apps, it should be called make an API call. The name should be make API call, just to make it consistent across all the different apps, and then performs an arbitrary authorized API call. Click Save. Again, as you can see, the connection has been added here. Within each module, there are a few as well sections that we can fill out. There is the communication, which is again kind of like similar to the base, which defines the basic info about the request, such as the type of the request, the body, the URL, etc. Then we have parameters which can be mapped or can be static. Mappable parameters are essentially when you define a new module inside of the scenario, you'll be able, those are like all the options you can fill out. Interface is once we receive the response from our request, right, from the server, how that response should be parsed, right, in terms of like what data types coming back, how we should name them, more user-friendly, let's say labels, etc. And then samples as well is kind of like sample data that you can see as well when defining module inside of a scenario. All right, in terms of the universal module, we actually need very little configuration because most of it is already defined here. The only thing that we need to do is define the fixed base URL. Again, this specification does inherit from the base, but what we need to define is essentially, so even so it says that the specification inherits from the base, it doesn't really inherit the base URL. So that's an issue, right? So as you can see in the parameters, in the mappable parameters that the user will be able to choose, they'll be able to put this URL that are going to be appended to the base URL, but we still need to choose the base URL over here. And for that, again, let's copy the one that we have in our base, and then let's say /API, and then / and whatever the URL our user wants to define. So for example, in this case, that would be, playground folder questions, or for example, document v1, again, document v1, etc., etc., etc. All right, let's click Save Changes in the mappable parameters, enter path relative to whatever, right? So for example, and also by the way, they're actually letting the user to include the \, so let's actually remove this from here, and then parameters URL will go straight after the API. And in the help text, we're going to say enter path relative to. I'm actually not 100% sure that we can use a connection here, but so I'll just say your domain.gavel.io API, for example, e.g. v2 users, e.g. Let's use the example from here. API /playground folder equals questions. Give instruction to the user about the relative path. And then again, it makes this accessible via parameters URL. The rest, we don't really need to modify because it's again kind of like standard for all universal modules, unless you want to make something very specific. In terms of, okay, right, continue, edit and save changes. In terms of the interface, we'll again just leave it as it is. We cannot really define an interface for a universal module because again, the output can be whatever, really. Okay, cool. So let's go back. We have our first module defined, we have our connection defined, we have our base defined. Now everything should be ready to go to actually start and make our first request. So I've gone ahead and created a new test scenario. Let's create a new module. Search up for Gavel. As you can see, it pops up. It shows as well as private. The logo shows up perfectly fine. Make an API call. Cool. Let's create the connection. We can name it whatever you want. So let's say API key Gavel. The API key will need to be sourced from our dashboard over here inside of the Gavel app. API keys. Copy. Go on here, and in terms of the domain, we'll need to put Chromium. Your Gavel domain, e.g., for example, Gavel.io, enter example, right? So Chromium in here, click Save. And as you can see, it executed fine, which means that first request got executed with status code 200, which means that everything was fine. So we have successfully authenticated our first request. Now, let's actually set up this API call. Enter a path relative to your domain Gavel /API, for example, playground folder questions. Let's use the same. So playground folder questions. It is a get, and then really there are no other parameters. As you can see here, there is nothing else that we need to define. So this should work. Let's save this. Okay, it will ask you the following apps have not been installed yet, but confirm the installation. The apps will become available for all users in this organization. Click yes. That's it. And let's run this module. Okay, it all executed fine. Status code 200. Body, fantastic. All right, we have the body with the array as expected as well from the documentation here as well. And if we go to our workflows, you will see that we have two: sample intake form and simple form, which is exactly what is returned by our request over here: sample intake form and simple form. That's great. We have executed our first request. I think the one thing that we want, I would like to finish this episode with is then error handling. As you remember, if you go into the base, we have kind of like skipped this portion over here because we didn't really know the format in which the API returns the errors. So let's actually check it out and see how it works. For that, I'm gonna just make an error in the URL, which should error it out. And as you can see, it actually returns a status code 200, meaning that it is as if it was executed successfully, which obviously is not the case. And then in the body, it returns just an HTML document saying you need to screw, which I'm actually not sure exactly what it displays. I don't think it displays any really useful information here. I think it's just, I guess, a login screen, potentially. Not sure. Anyways, sometimes the APIs do this. Instead of returning an error status code, they'll just return 200 and, for example, HTML, or they may, for example, return the error message inside of the body instead as well. In this case, we don't even get an error message; we just get an HTML. Not to worry so, because the custom apps in Make can handle that as well. If we go over to the documentation, error handling, we have this article on what happens if we get the 200 or 300 errors status codes. So we can define this directive called valid, which will actually have a condition, and if the condition is met, it will understand if the request was valid or it wasn't valid, right? So in this case, for example, how we can understand if it was valid or not is, for example, if the headers, the content type is text HTML, right? Because what we understand is that for all the other endpoints that we're going to be using in the app, such for example, I don't know, even downloading documents, it's really just PDFs and words. And for any other data, it will be returning it in a JSON format, right? So really meaning that if we get an HTML, that's probably because there was some kind of error and the request is incorrect. Unfortunately, again, we don't get actually information about the error itself, what was wrong, but at least we can notify the user and properly error out the module. Right, so let's go into our base configuration. As you can see over here in the error, we have the message. Again, we don't really have any information coming from the API, so we'll just on error will returns a generic error message. And the message will be invalid request. Again, unfortunately, we cannot provide more information. And we also have this valid directive, which will have a condition. And the condition will be essentially that the headers dot content type, and we can download as well the output bundles to make sure that we're copying them correctly. Content type doesn't equal, let me just check this is correct. So yeah, body status does not equal text HTML charset UTF-8. Potentially we can also use a function of like starts with, but I think that's fine. So headers content type is not equal to text HTML. If it equals to text HTML, that means that the request is invalid. Let's just add a comma here so it's all properly formatted. By the way, there's also this button here which can then help you format the code correctly. Let's click Save Changes, and when you make changes to the base, it should be reflected automatically, so you don't even have to refresh the screen. So again, we have the wrong URL here. Let's try it out. Okay, unfortunately it didn't work. Let's check why. So yeah, the correct requests have the application.json, and then the incorrect ones have the headers. Okay, I have figured out what was the issue, and the issue was that we cannot really use the dot notation here because it has the symbol over here. So we actually need to use a square bracket, put the content type in here, click Save Changes, and now again, if we have the incorrect request, let's run this. It errors out properly. The runtime errors just invalid request, no more information. But then if we switch it back to the proper URL, we run it, as the content type of this one is application JSON, it perfectly finds, executes, and marks as well executed. Now, the only other place where we would need to change this is actually in the connection. So here, if we go to connections, as well, as you can see, the response handling is separate because it doesn't inherit from base. So let's just make sure that we paste it here as well. Click Save Changes. And that will also apply the same logic to when the user is setting up the connection. So okay, let's overview what we did today. We looked at what are make custom apps, what is Gavel. We set up the basic of our app, including the logo and the name. We have set up the authentication using the API keys. And we have been able to make our first request using the universal module and configure error handling inside of our app. In the next episode, we'll start working through the next endpoints. First ones being list workflow names and list workflow variables. We'll define separate modules for them. And after that, we'll go for the more complex ones for actually filling out the form and then downloading the documents. And finally, also setting up webhooks for our app so that we can get notified when a new form is submitted or when a new document is generated. I hope you guys like it. If you have any questions about custom apps, please let me know. We'll be happy to help you out. And I hope you got some value out of this. Thank you.